I can point to the beginning of the business cycle and the Federal Reserve expanding the money supply and say, look at the state. The state did that. I can point to the war profiteers and say, the state led the war, and war is unprofitable otherwise. I can point to the obscene profits of the banking and oil industries and say, banks and oil have a special relationship with the state, which is why they can get things at the expense of everyone else, externalize costs. The anarcho-communist looks at me when I do that and goes, oh great, so now I'm sure, for all the sake of consistency, you will grant me the same mulligans. The USSR, after all, was a state that didn't follow my ideal plan either. And so the anarcho-communist, and I know the final step of communism is anarchy, but anarcho-communists just are that all the way. They don't want an intermediary step. The anarcho-communist will claim his ideology faced the same type of problems as that of the free marketers. That is, they had a state that screwed everything up. Now, the vanilla communists do support a state as an intermediary step, so part of their ideology is that the state would work. So a failure of state can be reasonably construed as a failure of ideology. Of course, there is the Nazi invasion and the Cold War, but the USSR had grown economically by various measures after 1948, during what we would call the Cold War, and was closing the income gap with the U.S. There was a period of gain for the USSR, and it occurred during the Cold War. It wasn't just a downhill slide from 1948 to 1991, so we can't blame the later collapse on the Cold War per se. Something must have happened between 1948 and 1991. The difference between the U.S. and the USSR is that the USSR failed to the extent that it pursued communism, while the U.S. has succeeded to the extent that there have been free markets. That is, to the extent that the U.S. government hasn't done anything. The obvious story is of agriculture. The private plots never consisted of more than 4% of the land in the USSR, but produced roughly 25% of food. Now, how this was determined had to be subjective. For example, does 1 egg equal 4 ounces of grain or something? So how you would determine that roughly a quarter of the food was produced on 4% of the land, you'd have to make some equivalency between, for example, eggs and grain. But because the disparity is so large, I'm not concerned with the exact details. When you have a quarter of the food being produced on 4% of the land, that's a real disparity there. What about the rest of the Soviet economy? Well, we've all heard of stories about shortages and surpluses of products in haphazard and chaotic ways, and this is to be expected by people who understand that prices, profits, and losses perform a calculation problem. When something becomes scarce, everyone wants roofing nails, the hardware stores realize their supply of roofing nails is falling precipitously and raise prices. This allows the stores to conserve their supply of roofing nails, and only the people willing to pay the most will then get the roofing nails. The hardware stores, wanting more profit, decide to buy more roofing nails from the nail producers, and the roofing nail producers then realize the hardware stores are buying all the roofing nails. The roofing nail producers then shift production from other nails to roofing nails, right? Because the hardware stores are looking, because the new roofing nail producers are going, all these hardware stores are buying all the roofing nails. We can raise our prices in order to conserve our supply. But now, what kind of nails do we want to produce? Well, we want to produce roofing nails because that'll get us the most profit. The roofing nail producers compete with each other to sell their nails. And as they produce more nails, more roofing nails, each producer has to lower prices. Sans cartels. I'll link to that in the article. And so each supplier gets more nails at lower prices, but then the hardware stores, to compete with each other for customers, have to further lower their prices, again, sans cartels. Thus, production of roofing nails is raised in response to demand without any central plan. But by not having prices in the USSR, roofing nails would be produced, and then there wouldn't be enough roofing nails for all of the houses that were ordered to be built. But to keep up with production, the house producers would use other types of nails. They'd use railroad nails, they'd use really big nails. And so Soviet architecture later on had to become rather plain and simple, something simple and uniform for the central planners to calculate. Whenever there were shortages, that is, whenever the central plan did not perfectly mimic what would have occurred on a free market, there would be an attempt to spring up markets to fill the gap. Black market roofing nail producers to produce the nails in exchange for other things people had, for example. Unfortunately, these markets were limited because people had to work at their tasks to fill their quotas assigned by the state, so any market activity was extracurricular. So how was anything done? Well, Soviet central planners could look at how things were being done in the US and the UK. They could see how much of various items were being produced in various places, and then attempt to mimic that in the USSR, making allowances for the differences in geography and demographics of the USSR. Of course, they could never get it completely correct, but they would always look off of other places to see what needed to be produced. For example, so in the US they produce 10 tons of roofing nails per day. So given our population differences and how many buildings we need to make, we should need to produce 18 tons of roofing nails per day. But do we have enough steel? No? Well, then we need to produce more steel. Not enough iron ore for the steel? Well, we need more mines, etc., etc. And all of that headache would be bypassed if they just allowed prices to function. No individual actor needs to understand the entire structure of production. Each person knows what actions will earn him money from other people in the structure of production. What costs more is what people are going to try to produce. Right? This also explains how the early USSR did much better than the late USSR. One thing I noticed when looking at images of buildings built in the USSR in the 1920s and buildings built in the 1970s is how much more ornate they were, not like the simple stock buildings in the later USSR. While the population was tied to the land in Tsarist Russia, there were prices, and so the structure of production was what I would say, for lack of a better term, calibrated. That is, things were being produced to satisfy real demand in response to the prices of things, just within the framework of Russian legal restrictions at the time, which were pretty awful and caused Russia to be poor. But as a result, in say 1919, the state could call upon architects and construction workers to build something, and there would be no shortage of roofing nails, for example, in relation to all of the other building material, because the structure of production was calibrated because prices worked in Tsarist Russia. And this all existed in 1916, and some of the calibration still existed in 1919, though there was no clear cutoff date when the Soviet economy was no longer calibrated. I'm not saying Tsarist Russia was good, but it was better than the USSR in this regard, in that the production was calibrated. In 1919, the central planners in the USSR could rapidly build an industrial infrastructure in a discalibrated manner. I'm not talking about the wonderful buildings and the architecture. I'm talking about the factories, which was not something that was really existing in Tsarist Russia. That is, all of the components of an industrial plan in the early Soviet Union would be out of whack. There could be plenty of concrete but not enough glass, plenty of cables but not enough cable spindles, etc. And the Soviet industry was riddled with all of these problems. That said, though, because Tsarist Russia was so restrictive, the central planners in the USSR, looking to the US, UK, and Germany for a general blueprint, bumbled their way into a higher standard of living. But there was no way the USSR could ever have reached the US. The USSR was dependent on places like the US for information. That's why there were so many industrial spies going over to the US. As the USSR became more and more industrialized and the per capita industrialization gap between them and the West shrank, the massive improvements in standard of living in the USSR stopped. All the USSR could ever be was a Frankenstein version of the US, the same general plan of a real market economy, but riddled with shortages and absurd surpluses that wouldn't go away, and this causing the production processes to be inefficient. The failure of the USSR was caused by the state's opposition to markets. The failure in the US will be caused by the state's opposition to markets. The advocate of a total free market can consistently blame the state on both the problems in the US and the USSR. The difference between the free marketer blaming the state for the failure of the supposed free market United States and the anarchist blaming the state for the failure of the communist USSR is that the USSR failed to the extent it attempted non-market modes of production, while the US has succeeded to the extent the market was let free. The failure of the USSR is egg on the anarchists' face, but the failure of the US is not egg on the free marketers. And this is not a double standard.